Chapter 9 in the Cathedral. An Italian colleague who was on his first visit to the town and was one of Banks' most influential clients was to be taken in charge by Kay and shown some of the town's art treasures and monuments. It was a commission that Kay would once have felt to be an honor, but at the present juncture, now that all his energies were needed even to retain his prestige in the bank, he accepted it reluctantly. Every hour that he spent away from the bank was a trial to him. True, he was by no means able to make the best use of his office hours as once he had done. He wasted much time in the merest pretense of doing real work. But that only made him worry the more when he was not at his desk. In his mind, he saw the assistant manager who had always spied upon him prowling every now and then into his office, sitting down at his desk, running through his papers, receiving clients who had become almost old friends of Kay's in the course of many years and luring them away from him, perhaps even discovering mistakes that he had made. For Kay now saw himself continually threatened by mistakes intruding into his work from all sides, which he was no longer able to circumvent. Consequently, if he were charged with a mission, however honorable, which involved his leaving the office on business or even taking a short journey, and missions of that kind by some chance had recently come his way fairly often, then he could not help suspecting that there was a plot to get him out of the way while his work was investigated, or at least that he was considered far from indispensable in the office. Most of these missions he could easily have refused. Yet he did not dare do so, since, if there were even the smallest ground for his suspicions, a refusal to go would only have been taken as an admission of fear. For that reason, he accepted every one of them with apparent equanimity. And on one occasion, when he was expected to take an exhausting 2 days' journey, he even said nothing about a severe chill he had, to avoid the risk of having the prevailing wet autumnal weather advanced as an excuse for his not going. When he came back from this journey with a racking headache, he discovered that he had been selected to act as escort next day for the Italian visitor. The temptation to refuse for this once was very great, especially since the charge laid upon him was not strictly a matter of business. Still, it was a social duty toward a colleague, and doubtless important enough, only it was of no importance to himself, knowing, as he did, that nothing could save him except work well done, in default of which it would not be of the slightest use to him in the unlikely event that the Italian were to find him the most enchanting companion. He shrank from being exiled from his work even for a single day, since he had too great a fear of not being allowed to return, a fear which he well knew to be exaggerated, but which impressed him all the same. The difficulty on this occasion was to find a plausible excuse. His knowledge of Italian was certainly not very great, but it was at least adequate, and there was a decisive argument in the fact that he had some knowledge of art, acquired in earlier days, which was absurdly overestimated in the bank owing to his having been for some time, purely as a matter of business, a member of the Society for the Preservation of Ancient Monuments. Rumor had it that the Italian was also a connoisseur, and if so, the choice of Kay to be his escort seemed the natural one. It was a very wet and windy morning when Kay arrived in his office at the early hour of 7 o'clock, full of irritation at the program before him, but determined to accomplish at least some work before being distracted for it by the visitor. He was very tired, for he had spent half the night studying Italian grammar as some slight preparation. He was more tempted by the window, where he had recently been in the habit of spending too much time, than by his desk, but he resisted the temptation and sat down to work. Unfortunately, at that very moment, the attendant appeared, reporting that he had been sent by the manager to see if the chief clerk was in his office yet, and, if he was, to beg him to be so good as to come to the reception room. The gentleman from Italy had already arrived. "All right," said Kay, stuffed a small dictionary into his pocket, tucked under his arm an album for sightseers, which he had procured in readiness for the stranger, and went through the assistant manager's office into the manager's room. He was glad that he had turned up early enough to be on the spot immediately when required. Probably no one had really expected him to do so. The assistant manager's office, of course, was as empty as in the dead of night. Very likely the attendant had been told to summon him too, and without result. When Kay entered the reception room, the two gentlemen rose from their deep armchairs. The manager smiled kindly on Kay. He was obviously delighted to see him. He performed the introduction at once. The Italian shook Kay heartily by the hand and said laughingly that someone was an early riser. Kay did not quite catch whom he meant, for it was an unfamiliar phrase, the sense of which did not dawn on him at once. He answered with a few fluent sentences, which the Italian received with another laugh, meanwhile nervously stroking his bushy iron-gray mustache. This mustache was obviously perfumed. One was almost tempted to go close up and have a sniff at it. When they all sat down again and a preliminary conversation began, Kay was greatly disconcerted to find that he only partly understood what the Italian was saying. He could understand him almost completely when he spoke slowly and quietly, but that happened very seldom. The words mostly came pouring out in a flood, and he made lively gestures with his head as if enjoying the rush of talk. Besides, when this happened, he invariably relapsed into a dialect which Kay did not recognize as Italian, but which the manager could both speak and understand, as indeed Kay might have expected, considering that this Italian came from the very south of Italy, where the manager had spent several years. At any rate, it became clear to Kay that there was little chance of communication with the Italian, for the man's French was difficult to follow, and it was no use watching his lips for clues, since their movements were covered by the bushy mustache. Kay began to foresee vexations, and for the moment gave up trying to follow the talk. While the manager was present to understand all that was said, it was an unnecessary effort to make, confining himself to morose observation of the Italian lounging so comfortably and yet lightly in his armchair, tugging every now and then at the sharply peaked corners of his short little jacket, and once raising his arms with loosely fluttering hands to explain something, which Kay found it impossible to understand, although he was leaning forward to watch every gesture. In the end, as Kay sat there taking no part in the conversation, only mechanically following with his eyes the seesaw of the dialogue, his earlier weariness made itself felt again, and to his horror, although fortunately just in time, he caught himself absent-mindedly rising to turn round and walk away. At long last, the Italian looked at his watch and sprang to his feet. After taking leave of the manager, he pressed up to Kay so close that Kay had to push his chair back in order to have any freedom of movement. The manager, doubtless seeing in Kay's eyes that he was in desperate straits with this unintelligible Italian, intervened so cleverly and delicately that it appeared as if he were merely contributing little scraps of advice, while in reality he was briefly conveying to Kay the sense of all the remarks with which the Italian kept on interrupting him. In this way, Kay learned that the Italian had some immediate business to attend to, that unfortunately he was pressed for time, that he had no intention of rushing round to see all the sights in a hurry, that he would much rather, of course only if Kay agreed, the decision lay with Kay alone, confine himself to inspecting the cathedral, but to inspect that thoroughly. He was extremely delighted to have the chance of doing so in the company of such a learned and amiable gentleman. This was how he referred to Kay, who was trying hard to turn a deaf ear to his words and grasp as quickly as possible what the manager was saying. And he begged him, if it were convenient, to meet him there in a couple of hours, say about 10 o'clock. He had hopes of being able to arrive there for certain about that time. Kay made a suitable rejoinder. The Italian pressed the manager's hand, then Kay's hand, then the manager's hand again, and followed by both of them, turning only half toward them by this time, but still maintaining a flow of words, departed toward the door. Kay stayed a moment or two with the manager, who was looking particularly unwell that day. He felt that he owed Kay an apology, and said they were standing intimately together. He felt that he owed Kay an apology and said, they were standing intimately together, that he had at first intended to escort the Italian himself, but on second thought he gave no definite reason. He had decided that Kay had better go. If Kay found that he could not understand the man to begin with, he mustn't let that upset him, for he wouldn't take long to catch the sense of what was said, and even if he didn't understand very much, it hardly mattered, since the Italian cared little whether he was understood or not. Besides, Kay's knowledge of Italian was surprisingly good, and he would certainly acquit himself well. With that, Kay was dismissed to his room. The time still at his disposal he devoted to copying from the dictionary various unfamiliar words which he would need in his tour of the cathedral. It was an unusually exasperating task. Attendants came in with letters, clerks arrived with inquiries, standing in the doorway when they saw Kay was busy, yet not removing themselves until he answered. The assistant manager did not miss the chance of making a nuisance of himself, and appeared several times, taking the dictionary out of Kay's hand and with obvious indifference turning the pages over. Even clients were dimly visible in the antechamber whenever the door opened, making deprecating bows to call attention to themselves. But uncertain whether they had been remarked or not, all this activity rotated around Kay as if he were the center of it, while he himself was occupied in collecting the words he might need, looking them up in the dictionary, copying them out, practicing their pronunciation, and finally trying to learn them by heart. His once excellent memory seemed to have deserted him, and every now and then he grew so furious with the Italian who was causing him all this trouble that he stuffed the dictionary beneath a pile of papers, with the firm intention of preparing himself no further. Yet he could not help seeing that it would not do to march the Italian round the art treasures of the cathedral in dumb silence, and so with even greater rage he took the dictionary out again. Just at 9:30, as he was rising to go, the telephone rang. Lenny bade him good morning and asked how he was. Kay thanked her hastily and said he had no time to talk to her, since he must go to the cathedral. To the cathedral? Asked Lenny. Yes, to the cathedral. But why the cathedral? Asked Lenny. Kay tried to explain briefly to her, but hardly had he begun when Lenny suddenly said, "They're goading you." Pity, which he had not asked for and did not expect, was more than Kay could bear. He said 2 words of farewell, but even as he hung up the receiver, he murmured half to himself and half to the faraway girl who could no longer hear him, "Yes, they're goading me." By now it was growing late. He was already in danger of not being in time for the appointment. He drove off in a taxi cab. At the last moment, he remembered the album which he had found no opportunity of handing over earlier, and so took it with him now. He laid it on his knees and drummed on it impatiently with his fingers during the whole of the journey. The rain had slackened, but it was a raw, wet, murky day. One would not be able to see much in the cathedral, and there was no doubt that standing about on the cold flagstones would make Kay's chill considerably worse. The cathedral square was quite deserted, and Kay recollected how even as a child he had been struck by the fact that in the houses of this narrow square, nearly all the window blinds were invariably drawn down. On a day like this, of course, it was more understandable. The cathedral seemed deserted too. There was naturally no reason why anyone should visit it at such a time. Kay went through both of the side aisles and saw no one but an old woman muffled in a shawl who was kneeling before a Madonna with adoring eyes. Then in the distance he caught sight of a limping verger vanishing through a door in the wall.